The soup was cold by the time it reached her end of the table, and nobody thought to apologize for it. Evangeline Ashworth had learned, over 3 long years, that this was simply how things were done at Ashworth Hall. The family sat according to rank. The food traveled according to rank. And by the time the tureen made its slow procession down the long mahogany table to the far corner where the poor relations sat, whatever warmth had once lived in, it was long gone. She did not complain. She had learned not to. Tonight was worse than most nights, because tonight there were guests, 20 of them, seated in their silks and their pressed linen, candlelight catching on borrowed jewels and real ones alike, and Evangeline sat among them, in a gray dress that had been let out twice and taken in once, mended so many times that she had stopped noticing the stitches. She kept her eyes on her plate. She kept her hands folded. She had become, over the years, remarkably good at making herself small. Her aunt, Lady Constance Ashworth, sat at the head of the table like a queen, presiding over a court that existed only because she allowed it to. She was a handsome woman still, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with a kind of beauty that had curdled into something colder with age, the way cream left too long in the sun turns first sweet, then sour, then something else. She ruled the household the way she ruled, every conversation, absolutely, and without apparent effort. Beside her sat Camilla, her daughter, golden-haired and lovely in a gown of rose silk that had cost more than Evangeline earned in a year for her services as unpaid companion, chaperone, seamstress, and occasional whipping post. Camilla was 22, the same age as Evangeline, though you would never have guessed it to look at them side by side. One girl glowed with the particular radiance of a woman who had never once gone without. The other had learned to eat slowly, so that hunger felt quieter when it was stretched thin across an hour instead of gulped down all at once. Evangeline. Lady Constance's voice cut across the table the way it always did, pleasant on the surface, a blade underneath. "You've barely touched your soup." "It's very good, Aunt Constance. Thank you." The lie came easily now. Practice did that to a person. "It's cold," said Camilla, and there was laughter in her voice already, the kind that came before the joke rather than after it. "Poor cousin. Evangeline always gets the cold soup. I suppose it's fitting. Cold soup for a cold sort of life." The table laughed. Not everyone, not the ones who had the decency to look uncomfortable, but enough of them. Enough that the sound of it filled the dining room like a draft, finding its way in under a door. Evangeline kept her eyes on her spoon. She had found long ago that if you did not look up, if you did not give them your eyes, they could not see quite as clearly how deep the wound went. "Now, Camilla," said Lady Constance, in the tone of a woman only pretending to scold, "that isn't kind. It's only the truth, Mama." Camilla's smile was bright and terrible, the kind of smile that had never once had to apologize for itself. "Evangeline doesn't mind. Do you, cousin? You're used to it by now. Living on charity does teach a person humility, if nothing else." Evangeline set down her spoon. She thought, as she often did in these moments, of her mother's hands, which she barely remembered anymore, except as warmth and the smell of lavender water. She thought of the small stone cottage where she had been a child before the fever took both her parents in the space of a single terrible winter, before she had been brought to Ashworth Hall at 11 years old, with a single trunk and a mother's locket, and the promise whispered by an aunt who had not meant a word of it, that she would always have a home here. A home. She had learned what that word meant in this house. It meant a narrow room at the end of the corridor where the fires were never lit until the family's rooms were warm. It meant mending Camilla's gowns and reading Lady Constance's correspondence aloud in the evenings and standing 3 paces behind, whenever the family went calling, close enough to be useful, far enough to be forgotten. "I don't mind," Evangeline said quietly, because it was easier than the alternative, and because she had learned that fighting back only sharpened the blade for next time. "Of course you don't," said Camilla. "You're such a good, obedient little thing. It's really rather remarkable, isn't it, Mama, how well she's adapted? One might almost forget she wasn't born to serve." The laughter came again, and this time Evangeline felt her face go hot, despite every effort at composure. She thought of leaving the table. She thought of the door, and the cool, dark hallway beyond it, and the small room, where at least the mockery could not follow her past the threshold. But leaving without permission was its own kind of crime in this house, and she had paid for that crime before. She was saved, in the end, not by her own courage, but by the sound of the front doors opening. It was not an ordinary sound. Ashworth Hall's front doors were heavy, old oak things that groaned when they moved, and they did not open at this hour, not on an ordinary evening, not without warning. The butler's voice carried down the hall in tones of barely restrained shock, announcing a name that made every head at that long table turn as one. His Grace, the Duke of Rysdale. Evangeline had heard the name before, the way one hears of weather in a distant country. Real, but irrelevant, something that happened to other people. The Duke of Rysdale was by every account she had ever heard whispered in servants' corridors and murmured over embroidery hoops, the wealthiest man in 3 counties and the most unmarried. He had inherited young, after some tragedy involving his father that nobody discussed above a whisper. And he had spent the years since building a reputation for being colder than the northern wind and twice as unapproachable. Mothers of eligible daughters spoke his name the way pilgrims speak of a shrine they will never reach. Lady Constance was on her feet before the butler finished the announcement, smoothing her skirts, already arranging her face into the particular expression she reserved for people whose favor mattered. Camilla's transformation was even more remarkable, her spine straightening, her chin lifting, her lovely face rearranging itself into something soft and inviting in the space of half a second, the way a cat arranges itself for company. "Your Grace," Lady Constance said, sweeping toward the doorway with both hands extended in welcome, "this is such an unexpected honor. Had we known you intended to call, we would have—" She did not finish the sentence, because the Duke of Rysdale was not looking at her. He stood in the doorway of the dining room in traveling, clothes still dusted from the road, tall in the way that made a room feel smaller for containing him, dark-haired, with a face that might have been called handsome if it weren't so entirely without warmth, weathered by something that had nothing to do with age. His eyes moved once across the assembled company, over Lady Constance's outstretched hands, over Camilla's carefully arranged smile, past the guests in their silks and their borrowed jewels. And then they stopped. They stopped on Evangeline, sitting small and gray and silent in the far corner of the table, with her cold soup in front of her, and something in his face changed, some flicker of recognition or purpose that she could not name and did not understand. He crossed the room. He walked past Lady Constance without so much as a glance in her direction, past the guests who parted for him without quite meaning to, the way water parts for a ship, until he stood before Evangeline's chair. And then, in front of 20 guests and a family who had spent 3 years teaching her that she was worth less than the dust on the good china, the Duke of Rysdale bowed, not a nod. Not the small, courteous inclination one gives a distant relation of one's hosts. A full bow, formal and precise, the kind reserved for equals, the kind that acknowledged rank rather than granted it as charity. "Lady Evangeline," he said, in a voice that carried clearly across a room gone suddenly, perfectly silent. "Forgive my lateness. I had hoped to arrive before dinner." Nobody moved. Evangeline sat frozen in her chair, her spoon still in her hand, staring up at a man she had never met in her life. A man who had just called her by a title that no one in that room, herself included, had ever heard applied to her name. "Your Grace," he managed, because it seemed the only thing to say, though her voice came out barely above a whisper. I think there has been some mistake. I am not." "There is no mistake," the Duke said, and something in his tone, quiet and certain, silenced whatever protests she might have made. "I have been looking for you for quite some time, my lady." The silence in the room had a texture to it now, thick and strange, the kind of quiet that comes right before something breaks. Evangeline looked past the Duke's shoulder and saw Lady Constance standing frozen by the doorway, her outstretched hands still extended toward nothing, her face draining of color the way water drains from an upturned glass, fast and then all at once. She looked at Camilla, whose smug, glowing smile had collapsed into something else entirely, something like fear. The Duke did not seem to notice either of them. He reached past Evangeline's untouched cold soup, and with his own hands he pulled out her chair, drawing it back from the table with the careful attention of a man seating the most important guest in the room, though every place at that table had already been assigned an hour before by rank, by blood, by the invisible ledger that Lady Constance kept in her head of who mattered and who did not. "Will you walk with me, my lady?" he asked. "There are things I believe you deserve to know. About your family, about your inheritance, about who you truly are." Evangeline's hands were trembling as she rose from the chair, and she was grateful absurdly that the Duke did not seem to notice, or if he noticed, that he had the grace not to remark on it. She had spent 3 years learning to disappear at this table. She did not know, in this sudden and terrible moment of visibility, what she was supposed to do with all these eyes upon her. "I don't understand," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it. "Your Grace, I have no inheritance. I have no title. I am a poor relation in my aunt's house, nothing more." The Duke looked at her then, and for the first time since he had entered the room, something almost gentle passed across his severe features there, and gone like sun through cloud. "That," he said, "is precisely what I have come to correct." To understand how Evangeline Ashworth came to be standing in that dining room at all, one had to go back 3 years, to the winter she arrived at Ashworth Hall with a single trunk and a locket that had belonged to her mother, and a letter of introduction that Lady Constance had read once, folded carefully, and never mentioned again. Evangeline's father, Charles Ashworth, had been Lady Constance's younger brother, a quiet man who had married for love rather than advantage, and been more or less disowned for it by the family that considered such things scandalous. He had taken his bride to a small estate in the north, modest but sufficient, and there Evangeline had been born and raised in a household that, whatever it lacked in grandeur, had never lacked in warmth. She remembered her father's study, the smell of pipe smoke and old paper, the way he used to let her sit at his desk and draw while he worked. She remembered her mother's garden, and the hours spent there, learning the names of flowers, learning to render their petals in pencil and later in watercolor with a precision that surprised even her tutors. It was the fever that took them both within a week of each other. The winter Evangeline turned 11, and it was Lady Constance, her only living relation, who took her in, not out of love, Evangeline understood even then, but out of a sense of obligation that curdled quickly into resentment. "You will earn your keep," Lady Constance had told her, on the first night, in the cold, echoing hall of a house so much larger and colder than anything Evangeline had known. "I am not in the habit of housing idle mouths. You will make yourself useful, or you will find that charity has its limits." And so Evangeline had made herself useful. She read to Lady Constance in the evenings when her eyes grew tired. She mended Camilla's gowns with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She managed the household accounts when the housekeeper's eyes began to fail, a task she performed with a quiet precision that no one in the family ever thought to acknowledge, let alone reward. She learned, above all, to be unobtrusive, to take up as little space as possible in a house that had made clear, in 1,000 small cruelties, that her presence there was tolerated rather than wanted. The one thing she had kept for herself, the one small rebellion against the slow erasure of her identity, was her drawing. In the early mornings, before the household woke, she would take her sketchbook, a battered thing with a cracked spine that she had owned since childhood, out to the overgrown corner of the garden that nobody else bothered with, and there she would draw. Flowers, mostly. The wild roses that grew along the crumbling garden wall, the foxglove that came up uninvited every spring. She rendered them with a botanist's precision and an artist's tenderness, cataloging colors and shapes with a focus that made the rest of the world, the cold soup and the cruel laughter and the narrow, unheated room fall away entirely for an hour at a time. It was, though she did not know it yet, the very skill that would eventually save her. 3 weeks before that dinner, before the Duke of Ruysdael had ever set foot in Ashworth Hall, Evangeline had been sitting in her usual corner of the garden, sketching a spray of wild honeysuckle, when a stranger's shadow fell across her page. She startled, nearly dropping her pencil, and looked up to find a tall, dark-haired man standing at the edge of the overgrown path, dressed for riding, regarding her with an expression she could not read. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not mean to startle you. I lost my way from the road and found myself trespassing on what I believe is your garden." "It isn't mine," Evangeline said, closing her sketchbook instinctively, though not before he had caught a glimpse of the page. "It belongs to my aunt. I only borrow the corner nobody wants." Something in his face shifted. Curiosity, she thought. Or perhaps something more careful than that. "May I see?" She had not meant to show him. She had spent years learning not to offer up pieces of herself for other people's judgment, not after Camilla had once found her sketchbook and read her private observations aloud at breakfast for the amusement of the table. But there was something in the stranger's manner, a stillness, an attention that did not feel like mockery waiting to happen. And before she quite decided to, she found herself opening the book again and turning it toward him. He studied the page for a long moment. Longer, she thought, than politeness required. "These are remarkable," he said finally. "The detail, the color notation here, in the margins, this is not a hobbyist sketch. This is scientific illustration. My mother taught me," Evangeline said, surprised into honesty by the seriousness of his attention. "She used to say that if you could draw a flower correctly, truly, correctly, you understood something about the order of the world. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was." Evangeline closed the book again, more gently this time. "She died when I was 11. The stranger's expression changed, then, something crossing his face too quickly for her to name it. Grief, perhaps, or recognition, or both at once. "I am sorry," he said. "I lost my own father young." I know something of what that particular absence does to a person. They had talked longer than Evangeline meant to allow, there in the overgrown corner of the garden, about nothing of consequence, and yet, somehow, about everything that mattered. He had asked her questions that seemed strange in hindsight, now that she understood who he was and what he had been searching for. He asked about her parents' names, her mother's family, whether she had ever seen documents relating to her father's estate in the north. At the time, she had thought it merely the curiosity of a stranger making conversation. She understood now that he had been confirming something he already suspected. "I should go," he had said finally, glancing at the sun climbing higher. "I did not mean to intrude on your morning for so long. You didn't intrude." It surprised her, saying it, because it was true. It was rather nice. Talking to someone who wasn't, she stopped herself. Who wasn't unkind, he finished for her, quietly, and something in the way he said it told her he understood more than she had told him. He had not given his name that morning, and she had not asked for it. Some part of her sensing, perhaps, that names complicated things, that a stranger in a garden was a small gift she did not want to examine too closely for fear it would dissolve. It was only later, standing in the dining room 3 weeks after, that she understood the stranger from the garden and the Duke of Rysdale were the same man, and that he had known it the entire time. The days following the dinner passed in a blur that Evangeline could not afterward reconstruct with any clarity. What she remembered was the silence that had followed the Duke's declaration, the way Lady Constance had recovered herself just enough to insist in a voice gone thin and brittle, that there was clearly some confusion, that Evangeline was merely her late brother's daughter, a poor relation, nothing more, certainly no lady. Certainly nothing that concerned a duke. "I would suggest," the Duke had said in a tone so quiet and so final that it silenced the room more effectively than shouting could have, "that you reconsider your certainty, Lady Constance. I have spent the better part of a year retaining solicitors to trace the lineage of the Ashworth family, following a promise made to my own father before his death. What I have found does not support your account of things." He had not explained further that night. He had simply asked Evangeline if she would consent to receive him the following morning to discuss matters that concerned her directly, and she had agreed, though her mind was so full of confusion and fear that she barely remembered the walk back to her narrow room, barely remembered lying awake through the small hours turning his words over and over, searching for the trap in them, because surely there was a trap, surely no good thing arrived this way, unasked for, unbidden, wrapped in a title she had never heard applied to her name. It was Mrs. Fenwick, the old housekeeper, who found her before dawn, sitting at the narrow window of her room, still dressed, having not slept at all. "You should rest, my dear." "Mrs. Spar," Fenwick said, setting down a small tray with tea that was, for once, still hot. "Whatever tomorrow brings, you'll want your strength for it. Do you know something?" Evangeline asked, searching the old woman's weathered face. Mrs. G. Fenwick had been at Ashworth Hall longer than Lady Constance herself, had known Evangeline's father as a boy, had been the one small, consistent kindness in 3 years of cold soup and colder mockery. Mrs. Fenwick was quiet for a long moment, her hands folding and refolding the edge of her apron in a gesture Evangeline recognized as the housekeeper's particular tell for difficult news. "I know," she said finally, "that your father was not always the disowned younger son your aunt has made him out to be. I know that before he married your mother, before your grandfather's temper cooled him out of the will, there was a title in that line, older than the Ashworth name itself, going back to your grandmother's family. The Rysdale line before it married into money and titles both. I know that when your father died there were letters, legal letters, about lands and a title that should have passed through the female line, to you, upon your parents' deaths, since there was no closer male heir living." Evangeline stared at her. "Then why did no one tell me? Why did Aunt Constance never say?" "Because," said Mrs. Fenwick quietly, "if you were legally established as your father's heir with title and land of your own, you would no longer be a girl your aunt could use as an unpaid servant in her household. You would be a woman with independent means. And your aunt, my dear, has been living for a decade beyond the income her late husband left her. She has been quietly borrowing against the expectation of Camilla's advantageous marriage to cover it. She could not afford for you to have anything at all, not while she needed every penny of the estate's remaining credit to keep up appearances until Camilla was safely wed to money." The full shape of it settled over Evangeline slowly, like cold water rising past her ankles, her knees, her chest. 3 years of cold soup, 3 years of mended gowns and unheated rooms, and casual cruelty dressed up as discipline. Not because she was unwanted, not entirely, but because her very existence, properly acknowledged, threatened the entire fragile architecture of her aunt's remaining social position. "Does she know," Evangeline asked slowly, "that the Duke has been searching?" "I don't know what she knows," Mrs. Fenwick admitted, "but I know she has been writing letters these past 3 weeks that she's had me post herself, rather than trust to the usual channels. And I know she met privately with a Mr. Dill. Pruitt. 2 days passed. A solicitor who does work for families that prefer their business, kept quiet." Evangeline felt something cold settle into her chest. "What sort of quiet business?" Mrs. Fenwick's hands stopped their folding. "The sort," she said carefully, "that makes inconvenient relations disappear from view. Not violently. I don't believe your aunt has that particular kind of courage. But there are other ways to silence a person. A doctor paid to declare woman of unsound mind, a private asylum that asks no questions so long as the bills are paid. I have seen it done before, in other houses, to other inconvenient women. The Duke arrived the following morning precisely at 10, and Lady Constance received him in the good parlor with a composure that must have cost her considerable effort to construct, given how thoroughly it had shattered the night before. Camilla sat beside her mother, unusually silent, her eyes darting between the Duke and Evangeline with an expression that was not quite its usual smugness. Something had frightened her, too, Evangeline realized. Perhaps the sight of her mother's carefully maintained world beginning visibly to crack. "Your Grace," Lady Constance said, "I confess myself still quite at a loss regarding last evening's remarkable declaration. Evangeline is my late brother's daughter, nothing more. Whatever title you believe attaches to her, I fear you have been misled." "I have here," the Duke said, and his voice had none of the warmth Evangeline remembered from the garden, only a cold and formal precision. "The marriage certificate of Charles Ashworth and Margaret Rysdale, dated some 24 years past. I have also the will of the late Baron Rysdale, Margaret's father, which specifies that in the absence of male heirs, the barony and its attached lands pass to the eldest legitimate daughter of his line, and through her to her own children. Charles and Margaret Ashworth had one child, a daughter, Evangeline. He set the documents on the table between them, and Evangeline watched her aunt's face as she read them, watched the last vestiges of her composure drain away. "This is absurd," Lady Constance said, though her voice had lost its certainty. "Even if this were true, even if the girl held some claim to a barony, it would be a trifling thing, some minor country title with no real income attached. The barony," the Duke said quietly, "includes freehold lands in 3 counties currently under lease, generating an income of some £4,000 a year, held in trust by the Crown, pending identification of the rightful heir since the death of the last Baron 11 years ago. My own father served as one of the trustees of that estate before his death. It was his dying wish that I locate Baron Riesdale's granddaughter and see her rightfully restored, a promise I have spent the better part of a year fulfilling." The number hung in the air. £4,000 a year was not merely comfortable, it was a fortune, more than Lady Constance's entire household income, more than Camilla's dowry, more than the family had seen in a generation. "You knew," Evangeline said quietly, and her aunt's eyes snapped to her, something like fear flickering there for the first time in 3 years. "You have always known. That is why the letter of introduction was never spoken of again. That is why I was never told my mother's family name." "I did what I thought best for you," Lady Constance said, and her voice had taken on the brittle, wheedling quality Evangeline recognized from 100 small manipulations over the years. A young girl, alone, with no one to guide her, no one to protect a fortune of that size from fortune hunters and schemers. "You mean," Evangeline said, and she heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt, sharper than she had ever allowed it to be in this house, "that you needed my silence to protect your own debts. Mrs. Fenwick has told me about Mr. Pruitt, about the doctor, about whatever quiet arrangement you were constructing to make certain I never learned the truth at all." The color left Lady Constance's face entirely. "That is a vicious lie," she said, but there was no conviction in it, and everyone in the room, the Duke, Camilla, Evangeline herself, heard the lie for exactly what it was. It was Camilla, unexpectedly, who broke the silence that followed. "It's true, Mama." Her voice was small, unlike anything Evangeline had ever heard from her cousin. "I heard you talking to Mr. Pruitt through the parlor door." "I heard you say that Evangeline needed to be, your words, Mama, managed before she caused difficulties. I didn't understand what you meant until just now, Camilla." Lady Constance's voice cracked like a whip, the old authority, trying to reassert itself. "You will be silent." But Camilla did not fall silent. She rose from her chair instead and turned to Evangeline with an expression that held for the first time in 3 years something like genuine remorse. "I have been cruel to you," she said. "I told myself it was only teasing, only the ordinary unkindness of cousins. But I knew it wasn't. I knew you had nothing, and I used that. I wanted, I think, to feel less afraid of my own situation by making you feel smaller than I was. Mama has arranged my whole life according to a marriage that will settle her debts, and I have hated it, and I took that hatred out on you because you were easier to hurt than she was." She swallowed. "I am sorry, Evangeline. I don't expect you to forgive it, but I wanted to say it plainly, at least once, before whatever happens next happens." Evangeline did not answer immediately. 3 years of cold soup did not dissolve in the space of a single apology, however sincerely offered. But she saw something in her cousin's face that she recognized, a particular kind of trapped exhaustion, the look of a woman who had also been made to serve a purpose, not of her own choosing, gilded in silk, though her cage might have been. "Thank you for saying it," Evangeline said finally. "We will see what comes next." What came next arrived in the form of a formal hearing before the Crown's trustees, convened in the County Assembly Hall 3 weeks later, to determine the legitimate heir to the Riesdale barony. Lady Constance, through her solicitor, attempted one final gambit, arguing that Evangeline's years of service as a household dependent, her lack of formal education in estate management, her general unfitness demonstrated a want of the judgment necessary to inherit and manage so significant a fortune, and that a period of guardianship, perhaps, under Lady Constance's own continued supervision, would better serve the ward's interests. It was, Evangeline understood, as she sat listening to the argument unfold in the crowded assembly hall, an attempt to construct, through legal language, precisely the kind of quiet confinement Mrs. Fenwick had warned her of. Not an asylum now, since that particular scheme had been exposed, but guardianship, a different cage, with softer bars, and control of the income that came with it. "I would like to speak," Evangeline said, rising when the moment came, her voice steadier than she had believed it could be. The trustees, 3 solemn men behind a long table, regarded her with polite skepticism. "For 3 years," she said, "I have managed the household accounts of Ashworth Hall, quietly, at my aunt's direction. Because the housekeeper's eyes had begun to fail and no one else in the family had the patience for the figures. I have here," and she withdrew from her reticule a small bound ledger she had kept in secret, "a habit born of a childhood need to understand the world through careful record, a complete accounting of Ashworth Hall's finances for the past 3 years in my own hand, along with the correspondence between my aunt and Mr. Stree, Pruitt regarding a private arrangement to have me declared incompetent, correspondence that Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, was asked to post, and which she copied faithfully before sending, out of concern for my welfare." She heard the intake of breath ripple through the assembly hall. "I do not believe," she continued, "that a woman capable of managing a household's finances for 3 years without a single error, capable of anticipating and documenting her own attempted persecution with sufficient precision to bring it before this hearing, can reasonably be called unfit to inherit her own family's title." The trustees conferred quietly. It was the eldest of them, a thin gray man with a reputation for scrupulous fairness, who finally spoke. "The chair finds the ward's presentation both lucid and thoroughly documented," he said. "There is no cause here to delay the restoration of the barony to its rightful heir. Miss Evangeline Ashworth, or as she is properly styled, Baroness Rysdale, in her own right, is confirmed as the legitimate heir to the estate, lands, and income of the late Baron Rysdale, effective immediately." The hall erupted into the particular murmur that follows any dramatic reversal of fortune, and Evangeline stood very still in the middle of it, feeling the shape of her own name settle over her like a garment finally fitted correctly after years of wearing someone else's cast-offs. Lady Constance did not wait for the full proceedings to conclude. She rose and left the hall with what remained of her dignity gathered around her like a threadbare cloak, and Evangeline understood, watching her aunts retreating back, that this was the last time she would ever see that particular kind of power wielded against her. Whatever came next for Lady Constance, and the trustees made clear in the following weeks that a formal inquiry into the misappropriation of a ward's inheritance and the conspiracy to have her wrongfully confined would follow. It would not include the authority to make Evangeline small again. It was the Duke who found her afterwards, standing alone on the Assembly Hall's stone steps in the cool autumn air, the noise of the dispersing crowd fading behind her. "Baroness," he said, and there was something in the way he said the title, careful and warm at once, that made her chest tighten in a way she did not entirely understand. "You knew all along," she said, "that morning in the garden. You knew who I was before I did." "I suspected," he corrected gently. "My father made me promise, before he died, that I would see Baron Rysdale's granddaughter properly restored, if she could be found." He had served as trustee of the estate for years, and felt the crown's stewardship, however well-intentioned, was no substitute for a family's rightful inheritance. "It took my solicitors the better part of a year to trace the marriage records, and by the time I had confirmed enough to be certain, I still did not know what sort of woman I would find. Whether she had been raised in comfort, ignorant of any hardship, whether the discovery of a fortune might change her for the worse, as it does some people. And instead, you found me sketching honeysuckle in an overgrown garden." "I found," he said, "most remarkable woman I have ever met, drawing a flower with more precision and care than most artists manage with an entire landscape, entirely unaware that she was, at that very moment, one of the wealthiest unmarried women in the county, and utterly unconcerned with impressing a stranger who had wandered uninvited onto her land. It wasn't my land." Evangeline said, though she felt a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth despite the exhaustion of the day. "At the time, no," the Duke agreed. But I suspected it would be soon enough, and I confess I found myself rather hoping the woman attached to it would be exactly the woman I had found. Evangeline looked at him then, really looked, at the severity that had seemed so cold and unapproachable at that first dinner, and saw instead what she had glimpsed in the garden weeks before, a man who carried his own grief quietly, who had made a promise to a dying father and kept it not out of obligation, but out of genuine conviction that the promise mattered. "Your Grace," she said, "may I ask you something rather forward? You may ask me anything you like, my lady. I am reliably informed. I do not always answer well, but I do generally answer honestly. Why did you bow to me first, before anyone else in that room? You could have taken Lady Constance's hand, played along with the ordinary courtesies, and revealed the truth of my identity more gradually, more gently perhaps, without humiliating her before her own guests. Why choose to do it that way?" The Duke considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "Because," he said finally, "I had seen in the moment I entered that room exactly what your aunt and cousin had made of you at that table. I saw the cold soup. I saw the practiced way you kept your eyes down, the particular stillness of a person who has learned that being noticed brings only pain. I had one evening, one single entrance into that house, to undo 3 years of being told you were worth less than the good china. I judged that gentleness would not accomplish it quickly enough. You needed, I thought, to see the truth reflected in every face in that room at once, all together, so that no one, not your aunt, not your cousin, not you yourself, could later pretend it hadn't happened exactly as it did." Evangeline felt something in her chest loosen, some knot she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its weight. "That is either the kindest thing anyone has done for me in 3 years, she said, "or the most calculated." "I am reliably informed," the Duke said, and there, finally, was the dry humor she remembered from the garden, "that it is entirely possible to be both at once." They were married the following spring, in a ceremony considerably quieter than the scandal that had preceded it, held in the small stone chapel nearest the Ruysdael estate, rather than the grander cathedral that convention might have demanded. Evangeline had insisted on simplicity, and the Duke, whose own preferences ran the same direction, had not argued. Mrs. Fenwick attended as an honored guest rather than staff, a position Evangeline insisted upon absolutely, and the old housekeeper wept through the entire ceremony, in a manner she claimed unconvincingly was due to the spring pollen. Camilla came too, though her mother did not. Lady Constance's formal inquiry had concluded some months before, with the loss of her remaining assets in restitution for the years of misappropriated income from an inheritance that had never been rightfully hers to manage, and she had retired, much reduced in circumstance and entirely alone, to a small house in a distant county where, by all reports, she still kept meticulous ledgers of expenses she could no longer afford to spend, a woman surrounded by the wreckage of a life built on maintaining appearances she no longer had the means to maintain. Camilla, meanwhile, had begun tentatively to build something different for herself, free of her mother's arrangements, and Evangeline found she could extend to her cousin, if not quite forgiveness, then something adjacent to it. A willingness to let the past remain past. At Ruysdael Hall, the household ran according to different rules than the ones Evangeline had known at Ashworth. No plate left the kitchen until every plate was ready. No servant went without a fire in winter. It was a small correction, perhaps, against the specific cruelty of cold soup served last, and coldest to the person least able to complain of it. But Evangeline found she cared about that small correction more than almost anything else her new position afforded her. She kept drawing. In the mornings, before the household woke, she would take her sketchbook out to the gardens of Ruysdael Hall, considerably grander now than the overgrown corner she had once claimed as her own, and there she rendered the flowers of her new home with the same patient precision she had always brought to the task. The Duke, she discovered, liked to sit with her sometimes in companionable silence while she worked, offering the occasional observation about a particular bloom that made her laugh more often than she expected. A year to the day after that first dinner, the one with the cold soup and the crueler laughter, Evangeline stood in the same garden where she had first met a stranger she had not yet known was a duke, her hand resting lightly against the small, unmistakable curve of her own body. and felt something settle into place that she had not dared hope for in all those years of narrow rooms and mended dresses. "You're thinking of something," the Duke said, coming to stand beside her, his eyes following hers to the honeysuckle climbing the garden wall. "I am thinking," Evangeline said, "that 3 years ago I did not believe anyone was coming. I had stopped waiting for it. I had made myself as small and as quiet as I could, because I thought that was the only way to survive a world that had already decided what I was worth. And now—" She turned to him and found in his face the same steady warmth that had first drawn her to a stranger in an overgrown garden long before she knew what title he carried or what it would mean for her own. "Now," she said, "I think I was simply waiting for the right person to bow first." He took her hand, then there among the honeysuckle, and said nothing at all, because some things, she had come to understand, did not need words to be entirely understood. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. If you felt something during Evangeline's journey, whether it was anger at the cruelty she endured or that quiet triumph when the Duke bowed first, I would love to know. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from tonight, and share which line in this story struck you the most. If stories like this one move you, stories of quiet strength finally seen and rewarded, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until then, from all of us here, good night and sweet dreams.